Edward Settle Godfrey Jr. served as a lieutenant in the 7th Cavalry Regiment of the United States Army throughout the American Indian Wars. He is primarily remembered for his crucial participation and his direct observation of the Battle of Little Bighorn, often referred to as Custer's Last Stand, occurring on June 25, 1876. Godfrey, who was part of the regiment's command staff, was instrumental in guiding a detachment of soldiers to security amid the conflict. He observed the combat and the ultimate overthrow of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer's units, and afterward composed a thorough narrative of his observations. Godfrey's report offers significant understanding into the occurrences of that day and is regarded as one of the most crucial and trustworthy first-hand descriptions of the Battle of Little Bighorn. But before we start, remember to like and subscribe to our channel to help support our community. On April 16, 1876, while posted at Macomb City, Missouri, I was given instructions to deliver my unit, K Troop of the 7th Cavalry, to the commanding general of the Department of Dakota, located in St. Paul, Minnesota. At that time, a group of 25 new enlistees, straight from civilian occupations, was added to our unit, increasing the total strength of our troop. We were then commanded to advance to Fort Abraham Lincoln, Dakota, where the Yellowstone expedition was being assembled with great urgency. This significant campaign, a powerful entity to confront, included the 7th United States Cavalry, under the leadership of the tireless General George Armstrong Custer, containing 28 officers and 700 men, 2 companies from the 17th United States Infantry, and a single company from the 6th United States Infantry, amounting to 8 officers and 135 men, a detachment of Gatling guns made up of 2 officers and 32 men connected to the 20th United States Infantry, and 40 Indian scouts proficient in frontier skills. Brigadier General Alfred H. Terry, Department Commander, took charge of the expeditionary forces, accompanied by his staff, who had arrived a few days before we set out. Their attendance helped to underscore the seriousness and significance of our objective. On May 17th, at 4:30 in the morning, the general's signal was given, a clear summons to movement. Tents were taken down, and the camp was dismantled with urgent speed. Wagons were loaded and sent to the quartermaster quickly, and by 6 o'clock, the wagon train was on its way, protected by the infantry, who marched with determination and exactness. By 7 o'clock, the 7th Cavalry was organized in a column of platoons on the parade ground of Fort Lincoln, an impressive sight. At the head, the band performed Gary Owen, the 7th's battle anthem, first used during the charge at Wachita, its rousing tune bringing back recollections of former triumphs. The column stopped and dismounted just past the garrison, where officers and married men were allowed to leave the formation to say goodbye to their families. A deeply emotional moment. General Terry, aware of the ladies' apprehension, had approved this display to ease their worries and convince them, by our impressive display, of our capacity to engage any opponent we might meet. Few onlookers assembled to watch the event, yet many eyes filled with tears observed us from behind shuttered windows, proof of the dread that held the hearts of those we departed from. During this pause, the wagon train was organized on the plateau west of the post and arranged into a column of 4s with accuracy. When it began to move, the assembly call was played, and those not present rushed to rejoin their designated units. The signals, "Mountain Forward," were then played, and the regiment marched off with resolve, the band performing "The Girl I Left Behind Me," a tune that moved the emotions of everyone who listened. The 7th Cavalry was separated into 2 columns, named the right and left wings, under the command of Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Benteen, in that order. Each wing was further separated into 2 battalions of 3 troops apiece, a structure that allowed for the effective performance of our duty. After the initial day, the subsequent marching order became routine. 1 battalion took on the duty of advance guard, 1 acted as rear guard, and 1 marched on either side of the train, thus guaranteeing our protection and defense. General Custer, along with 1 troop from the advance guard, would move forward to choose the best path for the train and indicate the locations for camp at the conclusion of each day's travel. The other 2 troops of the advance guard reported to headquarters for pioneer or labor duty, assigned to construct bridges and creek crossings, thereby aiding our advance. The rear guard followed at the back, giving help to any wagon that became stuck in the mud. The battalions on the sides were maintained within 500 yards of the path, and were warned against moving more than half a mile forward or dropping behind the train to avoid becoming unnecessarily dismounted. Our march was carried out with martial exactness. One troop marched until about half a mile ahead of the train, where it then dismounted, letting the horses feed until the train had gone past and was approximately half a mile ahead, at which time the troop began marching again. Each of the other two troops conducted their advance in a similar fashion, making certain that two troops on every side marched next to the train continuously. If the landscape was especially difficult, a half-dozen flankers were sent out to guard against unexpected attacks, adjusting their march to stay level with their corresponding troops. The pack animals and beef herd were driven along with the train by the packers and herders, who guaranteed their safe movement. One wagon was allotted to each troop, carrying 5 days' worth of rations and forage, plus the mess kit of the troop and the mess kit, tents, and baggage of the troop officers, along with 10 days' provisions for the officers' mess. The men were equipped with the carbine and revolver, although no one, not even the officer of the day, carried the saber. Every troop horse bore, in addition to its rider, between 80 and 90 pounds, a substantial load that incorporated all equipment and about 100 rounds of ammunition, 50 in the belt and 50 in the saddlebags. The wagon train, an impressive line of 150 wheeled vehicles, carried within it a substantial cache of supplies, incorporating 30 days' worth of forage and rations, beef accepted, and a substantial stockpile of 200 rounds of ammunition per man. The two horse wagons, obtained by contract, carried burdens of 1,500 to 2,000 pounds, evidence of their robust build. The 6 government mule wagons, meanwhile, transported loads of 3,000 to 5,000 pounds, their capacity dependent on the size and fitness of the mules pulling them. The Gatling guns, those very contemporary weapons, were each pulled by 4 cavalry horses considered unsuitable for riding, and marched at the front of the train. 2 light wagons loaded with a variety of axes, shovels, pickaxes, and various pine boards and scanling, enough to build a short bridge, went along with the pioneer troops, always prepared to aid the train's progress. The crossings, as they were called, often proved slow and drawn out, regularly holding up the train's advance for multiple hours. During these breaks, the cavalry horses were unsaddled and allowed to feed, their reins held by the men, who would sleep or gather in circles to tell stories and enjoy a pinch of their dingy Dedines. The officers, meanwhile, would assemble near the crossing, watching the train's advancement and spending the time in friendly discussion and humorous jokes. At around midday, the soldiers who carried the haversacks were called, and the different mess groups ate their lunch, sometimes on their own, sometimes together. When the haversacks were opened, the horses would usually stop grazing and come near their riders, stretching out their noses in a clear plea, obviously asking for a piece of the hardtack. If their quiet requests were ignored, they would scratch the ground or even nudge their riders. The experienced soldier, who knew his horse's habits well, would often choose to share his food with his animal. The distance we covered each day, which could be anywhere from 10 to 40 miles, was mostly decided by the difficulties we faced and the resources we found, like wood, water, and grass. The chance of finding these necessities near where we planned to stop would also affect how far we traveled. If sometime between 2 and 3 in the afternoon, a line of smoke was noticed a mile or 2 ahead along our path, it usually meant a campsite had been chosen. The cavalry, leaving out the rear guard, would then separate from the train and head straight for camp. The rear guard would send out groups to gather firewood and unload the wagons. The adjutant would show the wing commanders the general area where their lines or tents should be set up, and they would then guide the battalion or troop commanders to their assigned spots. Usually, one side of each line was placed very near the creek. The entire camp was arranged in a rough rectangle, with the wings camped on the longer sides, facing each other, and the headquarters and guard posted at one end, closest to the creek. The wagon train was arranged to block the opposite end, guarded by the infantry battalion. Once they reached their spots, the troops would form lines facing inward, get off their horses, and remove the saddles. If the day was hot and sunny, the men would rub the horses' backs until they were dry. The horses were then taken to water and led out to graze, held by sidelines and lariats, and watched by the stable guard, which included one non-commissioned officer and 3 to 6 privates. The troop members would then collect fuel, sometimes wood from a mile or more away. Sometimes dried buffalo dung was all that was available. The main guard or camp guard, usually made up of 4 or 5 non-commissioned officers and 12 to 15 privates, would report on horseback at headquarters and be sent to stations on high points around the camp and the nearby area, always watching for any surprise attacks. Each station was staffed by 1 non-commissioned officer and 3 privates. The officer of the day, besides his usual camp duties, was also responsible for the safety of the cavalry herds. Sometimes the job of protecting the cavalry herds was given to an officer, specifically called the officer of the herd. To save the grass near the camp for grazing in the evening and night, all horses had to stay outside the camp boundaries until retreat was called. When the train arrived, the headquarters and troop wagons went straight to their camping areas. The officers' baggage and tents were unloaded as quickly as possible. After that, the wagons were moved near the spot chosen for the troop kitchen, always placed on the side of the troop farthest from headquarters. The teamsters took the harnesses off their mules and let them graze. The experienced stable guard reported to the troop commander for work duty, which involved putting up the officers' tents and gathering firewood for their mess. The troop officers' tents were usually set up 25 yards behind the line of the men's tents, facing them. Their cook or mess tent was placed about 10 or 15 yards further back. The striker took care of the beds and set up the furniture, which typically included a camp stool, tin wash basins, and a mirror. The men put up their tents right after taking care of their horses. The fronts of their tents were lined up along a rope that was stretched out to mark the line. The first sergeant's tent was placed on the side of the line closest to headquarters. The horse equipment was laid out on a line 3 yards in front of the tents. The men were allowed to use their saddles as pillows. A pit was dug for the mess fire, and the grass around it was burned back for several yards to stop prairie fires from starting. After that, the cooks got busy making supper. Beef was given out soon after the wagon train arrived, and the needed number of cattle were slaughtered for the next day's ration. This was carried in the wagons. Stable call was sounded about an hour before sunset. The men of each troop gathered on the parade ground and were led to the horse herds by the first sergeant. Each man went to his own horse, took off the sidelines, and tied them around the horse's neck. Then he pulled up the picket pin, coiled the lariat, looped the end attached to the head halter around the horse's muzzle, got on and gathered in line at a spot shown by the first sergeant. The troop was then led to the watering place, which was picked carefully to avoid the soft banks and muddy bottoms of the prairie streams. After drinking, the horses were tied with lariats outside the camp area. The land directly behind the troop was seen as their own space and was strongly protected from others. After tying their horses, the men got their curry combs, brushes, and nose bags and went to the troop wagon, where the quartermaster, sergeant, and farrier used tin cups to measure each man's share of forage, each watching closely to make sure it was fair. The men then fed and groomed their horses. The officer in charge of the stables and the first sergeant oversaw the grooming, carefully checking each horse's back and feet to make sure they were healthy. If a horse's back got sore because of the rider's carelessness, the man usually had to walk his horse until the sore was better. Right after stables, the cooks called out loudly that supper was ready. The men with their haversacks and tin cups went to the mess fire to get their hardtack, meat, and coffee. If any game had been hunted, the men would do a little extra cooking for themselves. The mess kits for the troop officers included a sheet iron cooking stove, an iron kettle, pans for stewing, frying, and baking, plus dish pans, a small Dutch oven, a camp kettle, a mesh chest containing tableware for 4, and a small folding table. When the weather was good, the table was set up outside, creating a nice spot for a meal. The first part of eating was a practical affair, but once the main food was finished, the finer items were enjoyed more slowly, allowing time for friendly talk. After supper, pipes were lit, and if the weather was poor, the officers would move to the side of the campfire, sheltered from the wind. Each man, as he found his spot, would always poke or nudge the fire with his foot, turn his back, hitch up his coattail, and clasp his hands behind him. Retreat was sounded a short while after sunset, and roll was called, which both confirmed the men were present and checked that their equipment was prepared, as it was very unusual for us to be near any distraction that might tempt the men away. In 1876, there was not one ranch between Bismarck, Dakota, and Bozeman, Montana. The stable guards started their shifts at this time. The non-commissioned officers reported to the troop commander to get their orders for the night. These usually specified if the horses were to be tied to the picket line or allowed to graze, and included any special directions for looking after sick or frail horses. At nightfall, all horses were brought inside the camp boundaries. The picket line was run across 3 wagons in front of the men's tents, though 3 posts were used if we were staying in one place for a longer time. In the evening, the men gathered around the fires, singing songs and telling stories until taps was played. The cooks got breakfast ready, which was typically hard bread, bacon, and coffee. If beans or fresh meat needed cooking, the food was put into the Dutch ovens or camp kettles, which were placed in the fire trench, buried under hot ashes and coals, and then a fire was built on top. If the wind blew very strongly, all fires were put out to prevent prairie fires from starting. The cooks were woken an hour or an hour and a half before the réveillé. At the first call for réveillé, usually at 4:20 a.m., the stable guard woke everyone in each tent, and the officer whose job it was to be at roll call. Stable call came after réveillé and was overseen by an officer, taking about 45 minutes. 2 hours after réveillé, the command would be on the move. Naturally, there were events that sometimes broke the routine. Antelope were plentiful, and the men were urged by their troop commanders to hunt, offering a nice break from their usual tasks. General Custer, a keen sportsman, kept several staghounds which entertained themselves and the command with their unsuccessful chases after the swift animals. One morning they flushed a large buck near where the column was marching. Lieutenant Hare, with quickness, went after the hounds, overtook them, pulled his revolver, and shot the buck with perfect accuracy. Nothing especially noteworthy happened until May 27th, when we reached the Badlands of the Little Missouri River, an area of harsh beauty and tough landscape. On the 30th, General Custer was sent out with 4 troops to scout up the Little Missouri for about 20 miles. He came back that same day, having found no fresh signs of Indian presence. On the 31st, we crossed the Little Missouri without any trouble. However, on June 1st and 2nd, we had to stay in camp because of a fairly severe snowstorm. We stayed camped on the Powder River for 3 days, during which General Terry left for the Yellowstone to make contact with the supply steamer Far West, which was anchored at the mouth of the Powder River. He also went up the Yellowstone to meet with General Gibbon's command, called the Montana Column, which had 4 troops of the 2nd Cavalry and several companies of the 7th Infantry. Before General Terry left, it was announced that the 7th Cavalry would be sent to scout up the Powder River, while the wagon train, protected by the infantry, would go to set up a supply camp at the mouth of the Powder. When General Terry returned, orders were given on the 10th for the right wing, made up of 6 troops under Major Reno, to scout up the Powder, supplied with 12 days' rations. The left wing was told to give up all its forage and rations, plus the pack mules except for 4 assigned to each troop. Major Reno left at 3 p.m., and the next day the rest of the command marched to the mouth of the Powder. My troop was given rearguard tasks, and sometimes we were over 3 miles behind the wagon train, waiting for the packers whom we were training in their duties. So far, we had not met a single Indian, nor seen any recent signs of them, except for a small trail showing a group of agency Indians, maybe half a dozen teepees, who were on their way to join the hostile camp. The buffalo had moved west. Other game was scarce and hard to find. The signs pointed to the Indians being west of the Powder, and news from General Gibbon placed them south of the Yellowstone. Some officers from the right wing, before they left, said they were sure we would not find any Indians and were hopeful we would all be back home by the middle of August. Major Reno got orders to scout to the forks of the Powder, then cut across to Mispa Creek, follow it down to near where it joins the Powder. After that, cross over to Pumpkin Creek, follow it down to the Tongue River, scout up that river, and finally meet the regiment again at the mouth of the Tongue by the time his supplies ran low, unless he found something that meant he had to return earlier to get ready for a chase. A supply depot was set up at the mouth of the Powder, guarded by the infantry, and the wagon train was left there. General Terry, along with his staff and some supplies, boarded the supply steamer Far West and went up to the mouth of the Tongue. General Custer, with the left wing, marched to the mouth of the Tongue, where we stayed until the 19th, waiting for news from Reno's scout. The ground where we camped had been used by the Indians the winter before. Miles City, Montana, was later built on this campsite. The simple shelters for their ponies made from driftwood were still standing and provided wood for our fires. Several of their dead, placed on scaffolds or tied to tree branches, were disturbed and had their trinkets stolen. Several men rode around, showing off these trinkets with as much pride as if they were war prizes, and seemed no more bothered about the disrespect than if they had won them in a drawing. 10 days later, I saw the bodies of these same men, dead, stripped, and badly treated. On June 19th, news came from Major Reno, saying he had found a large trail going up the Rosebud River. The details of this find were not shared widely, so the camp was full of rumors, feeding our shared worry and interest. Belief was stretched to the limit, and we looked forward eagerly to hearing the details of Reno's discovery when we met up with his command. When we reached Reno's command, we learned they had come upon a large trail on the Tongue River, which they had followed up the Rosebud for about 40 miles. The number of lodges in the abandoned villages was guessed to be around 350, based on the count of remaining campfires. The evidence suggested the trail was about 3 weeks old. Importantly, no Indians had been seen, nor were there any fresh signs of them. It is not likely that Reno's movements were known to the Indians, because on the very day he reached his farthest point up the Rosebud, the Battle of the Rosebud was fought between General Crook's forces and the Indians, with the two commands not knowing how close they were, even though they were only 40 miles apart. We got to the mouth of the Rosebud around noon on the 21st and began getting ready for the coming march and the expected battle or chase. When we arrived, Generals Terry, Gibbon, and Custer held a meeting on the steamer Far West. It was decided that the 7th Cavalry, under General Custer's command, would follow the trail found by Reno. Right after the meeting, officers' call was sounded in the 7th Cavalry camp, and when we gathered, General Custer gave us our orders. We were to carry on our pack mules 15 days' rations of hard bread, coffee, and sugar, 12 days' rations of bacon, and 50 rounds of carbine ammunition per man. Each man was to carry on himself and in his saddlebags 100 rounds of carbine and 24 rounds of pistol ammunition. Also, each man was to carry on his horse 12 pounds of oats. The pack mules that had been sent with Major Reno's command had been through a lot and were in poor condition, risking slowing down the expedition. General Custer proposed that extra forage be loaded onto the pack mules to address this problem. However, when trying to put this idea into practice, some troop commanders, such as Captain Moylan and me, anticipated the likely challenges and warned the general that a number of the mules would certainly fail under the added burden, especially if the additional forage was included. He replied in an uncharacteristically forceful way, declaring, "Well, gentlemen, you may carry whatever provisions you consider essential. You will be responsible for your own companies. The extra forage was only a recommendation, but remember this, we will follow the trail for 15 days unless we catch the Indians before that time is up, no matter how far it leads us from our supplies." We might not see the supply steamer again. And turning as he was about to go into his tent, he added, "You would be wise to carry an extra supply of salt. We may have to live on horse meat before this journey is over." His advice was taken seriously, and an additional supply of salt was indeed packed. The battalion and wing structures were dissolved, and from then on, troop commanders reported directly to General Custer. As soon as it was decided that we would undertake this dangerous mission, almost every person made sure to send letters to their families, though I suspect few contained cheerful news. Some officers made a point of writing their last wills, while others gave spoken directions about what should be done with their personal belongings and how keepsakes should be handed out, as if they had a feeling about what was to come. The Sioux Indians, who avoided the agencies, choosing instead to roam the buffalo ranges and set up camp where they pleased, were known as the hostiles. They included members from different Sioux tribes and acted as a gathering point for agency Indians during their yearly hunts for meat and hides. Many among them were outlaw renegades from the agencies, famous for their boldness and tendency to stir up trouble during their stays. Attacks had been made on trade routes to the Black Hills, and many lives had been taken, for which they were blamed. The authorities in Washington had decided to force these Indians to live at the agencies, which led to the Sioux War. Major James McLaughlin, a respected United States Indian agent who served at the Devil's Lake Agency, Dakota, from 1870 to 1881, and later at Standing Rock Agency, Dakota, from 1881 to 1895, and now works as an inspector in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, has tried to find a reliable count of the number of Indians at the hostile camp during the battle. In his well-regarded view, which is trusted by those who know his work, about one-third of the entire Sioux Nation, including the Northern Cheyennes and Arapahoes, were present at the battle. He puts the number between 12,000 and 15,000. If we use a conservative ratio of one warrior for every 4 people, and consider that every male over 14 years old could be seen as a warrior in a major fight like the Battle of the Little Bighorn, the smallest number of their fighting men can be estimated at between 2,500 and 3,000. News from General Sheridan indicated that about 1,800 lodges had left the agencies to join the hostile camp. However, this information did not get to General Terry until several days after the battle. The main warrior chiefs of the hostile Indians were Gaul, Crow King, and Black Moon of the Hunkpapa Sioux, Low Dog, Crazy Horse, and Big Road of the Oglala Sioux, Spotted Eagle of the Sanzark Sioux, Hump of the Minneconjou, and White Bull and Little Horse of the Cheyennes. These individuals are acknowledged for leading the battle, though Gaul, Crow King, and Crazy Horse were the most influential leaders. Sitting Bull, a Hunkpapa Sioux Indian, was the head of the hostile camp, with about 60 lodges of loyal followers. As the host of the gathering, he welcomed and entertained visitors who brought him gifts, allowing him to give generously in return. In this way, he gained recognition as the chief of the hostile camp, which was often called Sitting Bull's camp or outfit. Sitting Bull was a strong, muscular man, about 5 feet 8 inches tall and 42 years old at the time of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. He held power as the unchallenged leader of the camp, mainly because of his role as host. In council, his opinions were highly valued, as he was famous for being a great medicine man. Although he was a chief, he was not a warrior chief, and his part in war councils was limited to having a voice and a vote equal to any other chief. Before the battle, he had performed a ritual and forecast that the soldiers would attack and be beaten. During the battle, he stayed in the village, conducting rituals, as was his habit in times of threat. The agency Indians saw him as a coward and a liar, a man with a big head but little courage. Chief Gall, born around 1840 to Hunkpapa parents, never lived at the agencies until he followed Sitting Bull in 1881, though he sometimes visited as a guest. By the age of 25, Gall was known for his courage and boldness. His cleverness and nerve were so remarkable that in 1866, the military authorities offered a reward for his capture, dead or alive, for a crime they believed no other Indian could have committed. However, Gall was not guilty of the offense. Knowing there was a bounty for his capture, he kept his distance from military installations. While visiting acquaintances at the Fort Berthold Agency, his location was communicated to the commanding officer at Fort Stevenson, which resulted in a unit being ordered to apprehend him. As the troops came into the tepee, Gall dropped to his stomach and pushed himself backwards beneath a lodge wall, where a soldier bayoneted him through the torso. Assuming he was deceased, the soldiers informed their commander of this and were sent to collect his remains. To their great surprise, Gall had recovered his senses and fled. The troops combed the adjacent woodland but were unsuccessful in locating him. Gall went back to his band, swearing revenge, a pledge he fulfilled through countless assaults and engagements. He persistently troubled military installations, assailing unaware persons even near the gates of the stockade. He also conducted raids on settlements, focused on Black Hills stagecoaches and freight wagons, and closely followed the Bozeman expedition in 1874, forcing them to maintain a state of alert for many days. Evidence of this event is still visible today, a defensive trench on the high ground separating the Rosebud and Little Bighorn at the source of Thompson Creek. In 1872, Chief Gall commanded his braves in a sudden assault on the 2nd Cavalry at Baker's Battlefield on the Yellowstone, an action that nearly ended in catastrophe due to its unforeseen nature, as indigenous warriors seldom initiated attacks after dark. On August 4, 1873, General Custer's forces had made camp on the Yellowstone's north bank, upstream from Fort Keogh, anticipating the main force under General Stanley. Gall exploited this situation to initiate a surprise assault, moving his fighters to within 300 yards before any alert was raised, leading to a spirited firefight that persisted until backup arrived from the main force, which had seen the activity from a distance. A week afterwards, Gall assaulted the 7th Cavalry at the head of Peace Bottom, where he rode with utter fearlessness, clad in scarlet and a war bonnet, through a storm of gunfire, yet managed to avoid injury. Gall's skill as a military leader was further proven at Custer's final engagement. In 1877, he went with Sitting Bull to Canada, and in 1881 he surrendered at Poplar Creek, Montana. His group was afterward transferred to Standing Rock Agency in 1882 by steamboat. On landing, Gall, magnificent in war paint and ceremonial dress, made a theatrical exit from the vessel, paying no heed to his mother's tearful pleas. In time, he adapted to the life on the reservation, evolving into a sagacious and traditional leader who endorsed Agent Major James McLaughlin's initiatives to better his people's welfare. In grand councils, Gall rose to become the most powerful chief, arguing for the equitable rights of his community. He died at Oak Creek, close to Standing Rock Agency, in 1895. His commanding appearance prompted likening to distinguished personalities like Webster, Henry Ward Beecher, and Bishop Newman. Gall had outstanding innate talent, strength of personality, and practical wisdom. General Custer was given written orders, dated June 22, 1876, at the confluence of the Rosebud River, Montana Territory, which stated Lieutenant Colonel. Custer, 7th Cavalry, the Brigadier General, commanding, instructs that, as soon as your regiment is prepared, you are to advance along the Rosebud in search of the Indians whose path was found by Major Reno several days earlier. Because it is unfeasible to give specific directions for this operation, and even if it were, the department commander places complete trust in your dedication, vigor, and skill, and therefore prefers not to issue exact commands that could restrict your decisions when in proximity to the adversary. He will nonetheless share his thoughts on your planned route and wishes that you adhere to them unless you determine it imperative to deviate. He proposes that you advance along the Rosebud until you determine the course of the previously mentioned trail. If it turns toward the Little Horn, as seems probable, he advises that you persist southward, perhaps as far as the Tongue's headwaters, then wheel toward the Little Horn, continually probing to your left to avoid the Indians' retreat to the south or southeast by maneuvering around your left side. Colonel Gibbon's column is currently moving toward the mouth of the Bighorn. Upon arrival there, it will cross the Yellowstone and move forward at least to the junction of the Big and Little Horns. Naturally, its subsequent actions will be determined by the situation as it develops, but it is intended that the Indians, if found on the Little Horn, will be almost surrounded by the two forces, making their flight unviable. The department commander asks that, while moving up the Rosebud, you conduct a detailed reconnaissance of Tulloch Creek's upper portion and endeavor to send a courier to Colonel Gibbon's column with intelligence on your discoveries. The creek's lower section will be reconnoitered by a detail from Colonel Gibbon's command. The supply steamer will be piloted up the Bighorn to the Forks, provided the river is navigable that far. The department commander, who will be with Colonel Gibbon's column, wishes that you report to him there no later than the time your soldiers' supplies are exhausted, unless you obtain other instructions beforehand. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, E.W. Smith, Captain, 18th Infantry, Acting Assistant Adjutant General. I trust this eyewitness narrative offers you a fresh viewpoint on the Battle of Little Bighorn and the Great Sioux War of 1876. This was the story of the Little Bighorn not just as a battle, but as a clash of cultures, strategies, and profoundly human decisions. It's a reminder that history is rarely simple, and the figures we remember were complex people acting with the information, biases, and courage they had at the time. But this is just one perspective. What do you think was the single most critical factor that led to the outcome of the battle? Was it Custer's ambition, the sheer strength of the Lakota and Cheyenne alliance, faulty intelligence, or simply the fortunes of war? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you want to dive deeper into the untold stories of the American West, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss our next video.